Welcome to People and Profit, where we look at how business shapes our world. I'm Kate Moody. Coming up, when the White House falters, the markets follow suit. Why one legislative defeat on Capitol Hill could spell the end of the Trump rally for investors. A new report exposes how much Europe's biggest banks have funneled through overseas tax havens. A year after the Panama Papers scandal, what's being done to shut them down? And as the UK officially begins the process of leaving the European Union, the curry industry already regrets its support for the Brexit campaign. First up, the Trump administration suffered an embarrassing setback as it failed to convince enough members of its own party to support its proposal to repeal and replace the healthcare law known as Obamacare. The bill was pulled before being called to a vote, and it sent global markets into a tailspin as it raised doubts about the president's ability to pass other legislation like tax cuts and infrastructure spending, which have helped boost trading since he was elected in November. House Speaker Paul Ryan said he was confident that Republicans would come together on the rest of the White House agenda.
Now we're going to move on with the rest of our agenda because we have big, ambitious plans to improve people's lives in this country. We want to secure the border. We want to rebuild our military. We want to get the deficit under control. We want infrastructure, and we want tax reform. Yes, this does make tax reform more difficult, but it does not in any way make it impossible.
And for more, we're joined by Ian Shepherdson, founder and chief economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. Ian, thanks so much for speaking with us. Tell us, why does one piece of domestic legislation have such an impact on the global markets?
Well, I think what it did was demonstrate the limit of the president's power and demonstrated his ability to make deals as maybe not quite as great as he thought it was. So what happened was that the Congress was effectively blocked by a few hardliners on the right of the Republican Party, and nothing that the president could say and nothing that the president could offer them would make them change their minds. So now everyone's attention is turning to the other legislation that he wants to pass, and in particular, the idea of a huge reform of the tax system. And people are thinking, well, if he can't get healthcare through the Congress, and after all, remember, healthcare is the one thing that they were all determined they were going to do very quickly. If he can't get that through Congress, what chance does he have of remaking the entire tax code, something which hasn't been done since the 1980s? How will he be able to find agreement among the Republicans, never mind the Democrats, to do something on such a great scale? And because the stock market had been pricing in effectively some very good news on the tax front, big cuts in the corporate income tax rate for a start, the idea that might not happen now is getting some people scratching their heads and thinking, well, are market valuations really justified at these levels if he can't do what he said he was going to do?
Well, that's certainly the question on a lot of people's minds. What's your take on that? What are the prospects, do you think, for the rest of President Trump's agenda?
Well, I think the idea of gigantic tax reform, root and branch reform, effectively tearing up the corporate tax code, starting all over again, introducing what's called the border adjustment tax, which has some similarities with the European value-added tax system. It's not the same, but has some of the principles. That idea, which some Republicans have been very keen on, I think is now gone. I'd be amazed if he could get that through Congress. So attention is starting to focus on a smaller package of sort of quick and dirty tax cuts rather than full-scale reform. I think he has a better chance of getting that through, but again, he's going to come up against opposition from his own right wing, from the Freedom Caucus, because those tax cuts are going to be unfunded. Where's the money going to come from? It would have to be borrowed, and the Freedom Caucus is completely opposed to any new borrowing, which means he might need to rely on some Democrat votes. But the Democrats don't like him, and they're sitting back and watching the Republicans squirm over the failure of healthcare and thinking to themselves, well, why on earth should we give the guy a hand? It makes much more sense for our chances in the midterm elections next year for the Republicans and for the president to be seen as failures. And that will improve our chances of taking back the House and holding onto our seats in the Senate. So getting Democrat votes on board for the tax cuts, that's not going to be easy either.
What about the issue of corporate tax cuts? Donald Trump wanted to cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 15%. Do you think that's feasible under the current circumstances?
Not now it isn't, because in order to do that, they needed to raise the money from the border adjustment tax, and the border adjustment tax proposal, I think, is pretty much dead. So a smaller corporate income tax cut, I think, is a reasonable idea. In fact, from an economics perspective and from a US government revenue perspective, cutting the corporate income tax is a very good idea. It's far too high, 35%. It's the highest in the developed world. The US tax system is uncompetitive, and companies spend a great deal of time finding ways not to make profits in America and make them abroad instead. It's very inefficient, and cutting the tax rate, I think, generally would be a good idea. But you've got to get through Congress. You have to find a way to make it happen. And to make it happen without offsetting spending cuts, which Democrats don't want, or offsetting tax increases, which Republicans don't want, it's a very difficult balancing act. Now, Trump calls himself the deal maker, says that's what he's best at. This will be the deal of his life if he can pull this off, because the math just is very much against him.
Ian, does this roadblock for healthcare signal an end to the 4.5-month rally that we've been calling the Trump rally or Trump trade?
Oh, it certainly puts real doubts on the sustainability of it, because I think going back to the election and what was happening in the stock market immediately after the election, it looks to me like investors priced in pretty much every possible piece of good news. They were assuming that Trump would get all his tax cuts, corporate and personal. They were assuming a huge wave of deregulation. They were assuming repeal of all sorts of Obama-era legislation. But now we're only going to get a little bit of that, if any of it. And of course, there was in the healthcare sector, they were assuming that Obamacare would disappear very quickly as well. So all of those things were priced in as though they were dead certain. But they're not. They never were. I think people were being very hasty and looking through the obvious problems in the Republican Congress, because it looks like a monolith, especially looking at it from Europe. You've got a Republican in the White House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House of Representatives. Surely they can do whatever they like. But American politics really isn't like that at all. It's much more factionalized. And the Republican Party in particular is a very, very broad church with people who have very little in common, except they like the principle of tax cuts, but working out how to pay for it and how to do it, they disagree completely. So markets, I think, have underestimated the risk that that fragmentation within the Republican Party would make Trump's plans very difficult to implement. And now we're gradually seeing that that is the case. And I think the market now, to me, looks rather stranded and overvalued, because it's pricing in a lot of stuff which I think is now very unlikely to happen.
Ian Shepherdson from Pantheon, thank you so much for speaking to us here on People and Profit. Next, the anti-poverty NGO Oxfam has accused Europe's biggest banks of funneling some 25 billion euros through tax havens in 2015. That represents a quarter of the lender's total profits that year. European tax havens like Ireland and Luxembourg were singled out as favorite locations. The report predates the Panama Papers leak, in which banks came under heavy scrutiny for helping their clients evade taxes. The author of the Oxfam study told France 24 that the scandal has, though, sparked a shift.
We've come a long way, to be honest, because, 5-10 years ago, it was hard to see those practices. Now we're pointing the finger at them, we're seeing them, we're talking about them all together, and I'm still, it's always a story of the glass half full and half empty. I think we're moving forward thanks to transparency requirements. That is, those requirements are new for the banking sector. So now they will be under even more scrutiny, and hopefully they will also be held accountable by citizens like us, but also by states, so that their practices will change in the near future.
So 1 year after the Panama Papers were first published, just what has changed in the fight against tax havens? William Hildebrand has been finding out. Will?
Thanks, Kate. The fallout has been significant. 6,500 taxpayers and companies are the subjects of at least 150 inquiries and audits in 79 countries. Now, authorities have seized millions of dollars in unpaid taxes. Meanwhile, $135 billion was wiped off the value of nearly 400 companies. And that drop suggests that investors believe companies will have a harder time avoiding taxes or may be hit by fines. Critics like Oxfam say political reforms are needed, since many of the practices uncovered are immoral but not illegal. One of the countries most often mentioned in the scandal was the UK, and London has rolled out anti-tax avoidance legislation. Meanwhile, the EU has made disclosure of aggressive tax schemes mandatory and tried to plug the gaps in its anti-money laundering and terror financing directive. But there have been setbacks. Panama has suspended its probe, and transparency advocates have said that lawmakers in various countries have been watering down legislation. And the UK rejected a register for companies based in the Crown dependencies, of which several are tax havens. So while London failed to deliver on that note, some are still hoping a global register may yet be established. And that would easily and transparently list the person who has significant control of a company and its profits. By the end of the year, the EU hopes to establish a blacklist of tax havens, and some governments are trying to increase whistleblower protection. The business world has come a long way, but Kate, a lot of work remains.
Keep an eye on that, Will. Thank you very much. Now, the British government has triggered Article 50, beginning the 2-year process of negotiating its exit from the European Union. But one of the country's most beloved industries says it feels betrayed. Many owners of curry restaurants backed the Brexit campaign after promises that it would lead to more much-needed visas for South Asian cooks. But negotiations over migration now look set to leave the industry with a dire staffing shortage. Catherine Viette reports.
Chicken tikka masala is as much a national dish as fish and chips. But the UK's curry houses are facing a shortage of skilled chefs. It's part of the reason why many restaurant owners backed the Brexit campaign.
They say that, if we support the Brexit, then we'll make sure that you get a lot of people from South Asia. And that is not happening, actually, because now they have turned around and saying something else.
Instead, Brexit may make the shortage worse by cutting off the flow of Eastern European workers that have increasingly filled the gap in recent years. Curry houses currently employ between 5,000 to 6,000 Eastern Europeans out of 150,000 across the country. But now many are wondering what will happen to them post-Brexit. Restaurant owners say they feel betrayed by the government.
People we are currently working on, helping hand for the European worker, Romanian, Polish, they are not going to leave. And so what we end up with is nobody to work for us. So we will be really closing our restaurant. Already see the indication of 2 restaurants each week is closing. 100,000 people depending on the curry industry.
Britain's curry industry is worth an estimated £4.5 billion to the economy annually. But it's not only the chef shortage that's hurt the country's 12,000 Indian restaurants. Competition from pre-made supermarket meals and rising food prices are also chipping away at the bottom line. All this adds up to a curry crisis that has forced restaurants to close up shop, with more to follow.
That's it for this week's show. If you have any questions or comments about the stories we've been covering, you can get in touch on Facebook at France 24 Business, or you can tweet me at Kate A. Moody. Until next time, thanks for watching.